Eucharist, purification, being properly disposed. So the understanding we have as Catholics is the Eucharist, far from being a present for the perfect as it's been characterized and mischaracterized, is actually this wonderful gift that we must be properly disposed for. Toward the end of this section of the book, the Pope talks about what does the Mount Sinai event establish. Mount Sinai is where Moses received the Ten Commandments and brought them back to the people. And it establishes this relationship between morality, law, and worship. Morality, because the Ten Commandments is a moral and theological code. Worship, because Yahweh, out of this, stipulates how he is to be worshipped. And law. We get the development of all of the ritualistic laws, dietary laws, and other things that flow from the covenant in the other books of the New Testament, in those first 5. So, as we mention these things, and I'll move to the next slide, if you note the triangle, this is one of the building blocks actually of Western civilization. The relationship between worship, morality, and law. In the people of Israel, they are one in the covenant. There is no separation between them. And it all happens in the desert before they get to the Holy Land. So let me read the quote here from the Spirit of the Liturgy. Sinai is not a halfway house, a kind of stop for refreshment on the road to what really matters. No, Sinai gives Israel, so to speak, its interior land, without which the exterior one would be a cheerless prospect. Israel is constituted as a people through covenant and the divine law it contains. It has received a common rule for righteous living. This and this alone is what makes the land, the promised land that they will eventually inherit, a real gift. Sinai remains present in the promised land once they arrive there. When the reality of Sinai is lost, the land too is inwardly lost until finally the people are thrust into exile. And we talked about that a bit last week. Whenever Israel falls away from the right worship of God, when she turns away from God to false gods, the powers and values of the world, her freedom collapses too. This real canon in the canon, the very heart of Israel's Bible, is set entirely outside the Holy Land. The one last thing I will note in this episode, which Pope Benedict points out, is when Moses delays too long on the mountain, the people get restless. They need a concrete God. They need something they can touch, taste, and they make the golden calf. And this, for Pope Benedict, is a danger in our liturgies today, to make worship of God a form of self-worship, which you might recall was a theme in Class 2 and in Class 1, this sovereign self idea, that me, myself, and I is the Holy Trinity. And the quote here at the bottom, when Moses stays away far too long and God himself becomes inaccessible, the people just fetch him back. Worship becomes a feast the community gives itself, a festival of self-affirmation. The dance around the golden calf is an image of this self-seeking worship. It is a kind of banal self-gratification, a warning about any kind of self-initiated and self-seeking worship. I would add my gloss to this, which the Pope, in other chapters, which we won't cover tonight, adds, which is, we are a community of faith in God. The community is not what we worship when we go to Mass. And whether churches are designed in a particular way in the round, as St. Mary's has been modified, it was not always that way, by the way, architecture promotes worship, and it can also promote worshiping the community. The community is a community in God. That's where our unity comes from, communing in God in truth and love, which flows to all of us. When we become the focus of worship, we've erected a golden calf of sorts. Now, don't worry, churches that are designed in the round like ours, they're not bad churches, so don't take it that way. But liturgically speaking, and there are many beautiful churches who have that design. We could even think about St. Peter's in Rome. But putting that aside, in a confined space, architecturally, you're saying something about what are you adoring, what are you worshiping. And I'll just leave it at that. Going ahead, I want to pivot now to what I call polytheistic and non-theistic nature cults. You might say, good heavens, what is that? I now want to take a step back from the history of the Old Testament and just talk about worship, generally speaking, in the top half of this slide. I know there's a lot of words on it, but if you think about the history of worship across all cultures and civilizations, they have some interesting common characteristics. You could go all the way back to the basic Mesopotamian cults, which have been dug up and cave walls have been seen, of animal sacrifice. It's the most common one across all religions. There's a sense in which God has given us fertile farmland, He's given us livestock. We will offer something back to God as a way of creating balance, as a way of propitiating or making sacrifice to gods who help us. The Greek myths are full of stories about making do to the gods who look over us and care for us. Probably most popular is, remember Socrates, his closing words, so he drinks the hemlock, his feet are starting to get cold, his extremities are starting to tighten up, and he says to his friend, sacrifice a dove to Asclepius, the god of healing. Because in the temples in Greece, if you were sick or on the verge of death, to avoid death, you would sacrifice doves to this god of healing. So there's a sense in which something has to be destroyed and offered to receive a remedy or a peaceful death. In the case of Socrates, perhaps liberation from the limits of matter. You could go to other religions. Probably the most extreme ones we're aware of are the Aztecs, where human sacrifice was made to make happy the gods of farming or of the sun. So we could trace this common back and forth, this circular movement, this giving and receiving in all religions. And the Pope notes that man in all of this is kind of a hinge figure, kind of a plaything that is mediating between gods that are obscure and the events on earth. And man's role is to mediate between, will the earth pour forth fruits? Will the river not flood? British soldiers, when India was a colony of Britain, would note that when the flood waters were rising in the rivers, they would start tossing goats in the river, and the waters would eventually recede. So there's this, across all civilizations, all themes, this giving, this back and forth. This is interesting, and it discloses a fundamental, as I call it, genuine human intuition that the Pope notes. The gods provide, and we make a sacrifice in gratitude for them. And there's this endless cosmic circular movement, this cycle. What's interesting about Judaism and the people of Israel is another radical inbreaking of monotheism was harmonizing creation and worship of God. Not to be adversarial, not to be, if I do X, I'll get Y, but to harmonize the two. And so what we will briefly talk about is this call response, this loop between us and God and back, as the Pope calls it, a shadowy pagan reciprocity, would exclude a personal relationship with God because you're bargaining. But the covenant is about establishing a friendship with God, not a barter system. If I give you 3 goats and a mule, we will have good weather for raising crops. So you see that God seeks a friendship with us and breaks this cosmic cycle that all other pagan religions or polytheistic religions had. Let me read to you how this occurs in the Old Testament specifically. In the Old Testament account of creation, chapters 1 and 2, these views are certainly discernible, but at the same time transformed. Creation moves toward the Sabbath, to the day on which man and the whole created order participates in God's rest, in his freedom. Nothing is said directly about worship, still less about the Creator needing the gifts of men. The Sabbath, in these first 2 chapters of Genesis, is a vision of freedom. On this day, slave and masters are equal. The hallowing of the Sabbath means precisely this: a rest from all relationships of subordination and a temporary relief from all burden of work. The Sabbath is the sign of the covenant between God and man. It sums up the inward essence of the covenant. Creation exists to be a place for the covenant that God wants to make with man. The goal of creation is the covenant, the love story of God and man. You know, in all other pagan forms of worship, it's a zero-sum game, as I call it. I give something, not to get it back. I sacrifice the goat, the river doesn't flood. I give crops or sacrifice animals, and I have a larger family. I sacrifice a dove, I get my health back. This is a zero-sum game, and we have the same. You might think, well, Charles, no one acts that way today. You'll note my little plastic bag reference, but we, as I was developing last class, have a problem in our culture today of earth worship. As Pascal called it in another context several hundred years before, pagans lick the earth. They have a magnetism, a gravity back to earth worship. And we have our flavor of it with the extreme aspects of the global warming movement, which views man as the enemy of the planet and burning fossil fuels as the primary cause of warming, which of course has not been demonstrated scientifically. So we have this same, I'm going to sacrifice plastic. I'm going to tell third world countries they shouldn't have air conditioning because of the emissions, while I write that in a first world air conditioned office. I'll fly in on a jet to tell people in second and third world peoples why they should live a certain lifestyle. And then I return to my own lifestyle. So we have spent hundreds of billions of dollars sacrificing to the god of Gaia, sacrificing wealth, sacrificing other conventions for the sake of what exactly? So let's not pretend this is just ancient theater, doesn't apply to us today. We enact it today with our own sacraments and our own rituals of the blue recycle bin, the virtue signaling of driving certain vehicles, and so on. So let's not pretend it's not part of our pagan culture today. You see how these themes return in different names and guises. So with this, we contrast the Judeo-Christian concept or view, I took out view, conception of sacrifice as the union of God and man, something very different. Not a barter system, union, friendship, not a transaction, real communion with God. As the Pope writes, can such pagan acts of worship, a mechanical act, really serve God's glory? Obviously not. True surrender to God looks very different. It consists in the union of man and creation with God. Belonging to God has nothing to do with destruction or non-being. It is rather a way of being. It means emerging from a state of separation, of apparent autonomy, of existing only for oneself and in oneself. It means losing oneself as the only possible way of finding oneself. That is why St. Augustine could say that the true sacrifice is love transformed mankind. The divinization of creation and the surrender of all things to God. God all in all. That is the purpose of the world. That is the essence of sacrifice and worship, a world of freedom and love. We will elaborate on that, and there's a lot in that. But you see how there's a difference fundamentally between how pagans worship and polytheists and animists worship and how the people of Israel and later Christians will worship. So let's get a little palate cleanser, an eye cleanser. We can clear our minds a little bit. But you have a neighbor, and they're a very good neighbor. They're not Catholic, they're not Christian, they're not anything. But they're a great person. And we all have met people like this. And they see you going to church on Sunday, or maybe you just happen to, it comes up in conversation at this summer's barbecue. And the question comes, what is distinctive about what we do on Sunday morning as Catholics versus people who might do a yoga or meditation class, who recycle religiously, who drive Teslas, who have sun panels on their house, subsidized by the government, paid for by you through ComEd. So why do I need religious worship? Why do I need Catholic worship? What's so different about it than all the good things I do for the planet, for my neighbor? What are you people up to on Sundays? What is distinctive? Let's first start by putting a little more shape to what I will call exodus and return. This concept I'll make clear. So the Pope is describing, in this last piece, pagan worship. The exodus, the outpouring, by which non-divine being makes its appearance, is seen not as a going out, but as a falling down, a precipitation from the heights of the divine, and by the laws of falling, it hurtles into ever greater depths, farther and farther into remoteness from God. This means that non-divine being is itself as such fallen being. Finitude is already a kind of sin. Let me stop there and explain what he's getting at. The pagan view of this world is that it is a fall from the gods. It is limited. It has its torments and baggage that we all must shoulder through. That's its sin, that it is a fall from the heights. Think of Platonic philosophy. The universal good, true, beautiful is what's real, ideal. It's out of matter. So right away there is an opposition between this world and the gods, because we're below the gods. So finitude is already a kind of sin, something negative which has to be saved by being brought back into the infinite through worship, through sacrifice. And so the journey back, the reditus, which means return, begins when the fall is arrested in the outer depths so that the arrow points upward. That's when we sacrifice back. The arrow will point back. In the end, the sin of the finite, of not being God, disappears. And in that sense, God becomes all in all. The way of reditus means redemption, and redemption means liberation from finitude, which is the real burden of our existence. Cult then has to do with the movement of turning around. The pagan conceptions of worship offer the hope that at some time in the wanderings of existence, the point will be reached when at last we can find escape from finitude and its torments. The religions of the Far East have the same basic pattern, which is why they're so popular today among Westernites. That is why the various kinds of teaching on redemption that they offer seem highly plausible. Exercises for relaxing the body and emptying the mind are seen as the path to redemption. They aim at liberation from finitude. Indeed, they momentarily anticipate that liberation and have so-called salvific power. So to summarize, this world, creation, small c, is a fall from grace, a fall from what's divine, a fall from what's infinite. That's its sin. How do we get the broken glass back together again? That's the negation of the divine. We have to make sacrifices in pagan worship to appease a broken world, a broken humanity. The barter system that I was telling you about earlier. Now the Pope will contrast Christian worship to pagan worship. And don't worry, there's a chart after this slide where I do my little summary to connect dots, so don't worry. Christian worship in contrast to pagan worship. Christian thought has taken up the schema, the model, the paradigm of exitus and reditus, this exodus, this outpouring from God of creation, and the return we make to God through sacrifice. But in doing so, it distinguishes the two movements from one another. Exitus is not a fall from the infinite, the rupture of being, and thus the cause of all sorrow of the world. No, exitus is first and foremost something thoroughly positive. God created us good first. All creation was first created good. It is the Creator's free act of creation. It is His positive will that the created order should exist as something good in relation to Himself, from which a response of freedom and love can be given back to Him. Non-being is not therefore something negative in itself, but on the contrary, the wholly positive fruit of the divine will. It depends not on a disaster. Recall the polytheistic creation contests we talked about when we looked at the Babylonian myths last week, as well as the Greek myths. Creation, man was the result of a fight, of conflict. That's why we're fallen. Remember? These are the pagan myths of the ancient world, and they're the pagan myths of today. We are something derivative, incomplete, by being finite. Okay. It depends not on a disaster, but on a divine decree that is good and does good, God's act of creation. The act of God's being which causes created being is an act of freedom. Recall we touched on that last week, that God creates us freely out of love. In this respect, the principle of freedom is present in being itself, from the ground upward. The exitus, or rather God's free act of creation, is indeed ordered toward the redatus, the return we make in worship. But that does not mean the rescinding of created being. The creature, existing in its own right, comes home to itself, and this act is an answer in freedom to God's love. It accepts creation from God as His offer of love, and thus ensues a dialogue of love, that wholly new kind of unity that love alone can create. The being of the other is not absorbed or abolished, but rather in giving itself, it becomes fully itself. This redatus is a return, the act of worship we make back to God. But it does not abolish creation. Rather, it bestows its full and final perfection. This is how Christians understand God being all in all. Let me continue, because how then does the fall in creation, in Genesis, fit this? Then we'll summarize. The fall and redemption. But everything is bound up with freedom, man's freedom. And the creature has the freedom to turn the positive outpouring of God, the exitus of its creation around, as it were, to rupture it in the fall. This is the refusal to be dependent, and it is rejected. In its place comes autonomy and autarky, existing from oneself, being a God of one's own making. The arch from exitus to reditus is broken. The natural harmony that exists between God and creation was broken in the fall. That creation was created good was broken. Pagans seek to make amends of that by tossing animals into rivers and sacrificing different things. And the people of Israel took up some of that in their own practices as well. So I'm not simply minimizing that. But as the Pope said, that pagan shadowy reciprocity will be elevated in the people of Israel and then, of course, in Christianity. continuing. So this arch is broken. Thus the title of our theme tonight of Bridging the Gap. That's what the liturgy and Eucharist do. The return is no longer desired after the fall. And ascent by one's own powers proves to be impossible. If sacrifice in its essence is simply returning to love and therefore divinization, worship now has a new aspect, the healing of wounded freedom, atonement, purification, deliverance from estrangement, the loving transformation of broken freedom, of painful expiation. Worship is directed to other in himself, refers to the other who alone can extricate me from the knot that I myself cannot untie. Redemption now needs a redeemer. That's a lot of material. And I remember when I first read this quite a while ago, it took me several readings to say, what is going on here? And you might be thinking that, Charles, you've taken us on a long walk. We've enjoyed it, but we wish we could trace our steps back. But let me try to summarize this in a more contemporary way, what the Pope has been talking about, this exodus and return, this exitus in Latin and reditus, of this outpouring of God and our response. If you look at this slide, and if we go left to right, universe, creation, exodus, in a pagan, secular, shall I say Gnostic, because these heresies have now come back, point of view, creation represents something already fallen. In what sense? In its material sense. The more material, the more remote, the more opaque from what is truly divine, what is truly spiritual. Finite being is a rupture. It's discontinuous with God, an infinite being. Remember when we were talking about the dualisms of my true self is my spiritual self. So what I do with my body as it relates to gender, as it relates to any other thing I want to do, is secondary, because what it's really about is my spiritual self, which has nothing to do with material considerations at all. Remember. I give some examples there. For those of you who are philosophical, Hegel's philosophy represents the last gasp of this philosophically in the West, of the infinite falls and is progressive in history, would be another way of thinking about this in Hegel. In Asian philosophies, this is very popular as well, whether the different forms of Buddhism or Hinduism. From a Catholic perspective, a Judeo-Christian perspective, creation is an outpouring of God's love. It's good. We can even see God, and it points to God. We bear a real image and likeness to God as created finite material being. We can image God, and we talked about how we do that in Genesis, as man and woman, as body and soul. The body isn't bad. The body isn't evil. I'm not a ghost in a machine. No dualism. You see how in our pagan understanding today, I can do whatever I want to my body because my true self is spiritual. You see how that's a pagan understanding? And it informs a pagan morality. We think we are created in God's image, body and soul, man and woman. Let's talk about the return pagans make, what's called redetus in the Pope's work. Fulfillment, redemption, pagan redemption today and in the ancient world means escape from finitude. And as the Pope says, it's baggage and torments. Salvation is self-awareness. Reflection. Gnosis means knowledge. Gnosticism is special knowledge, special self-awareness. Spiritual escape, what the Pope calls erasure of what it is merely individual, material, given. This is what we're seeing today in the unraveling of the self. What does the Pope mean by that expression? And other articles have been written about it. Remember when I referred to the liquid self today? The sovereign self can recast itself any way it would like to. There are no material constraints from a moral perspective on doing that. My true self is a spiritual self. This is the outgrowth of this pagan understanding of the outpouring of God, the exodus of God, and the return we make, our own personal redemption. What's the Judeo-Christian understanding of redemption? It is not liberation from finitude. It is liberation from sin. That's what the fall launched. The true obstacle to God is sin, not being finite beings. Now, that might sound, Charles, you see what I'm getting at, though, in our culture today? That we have traded down away from the one true living God who made everything and shifted the focus to me, myself, and I, and how I rebuild myself through all the appetites I might have, restrained or unrestrained. That's not a Christian understanding of redemption at all. Real communion with God through a free act we all do under the impulse of grace, of love of God. Real communion with an infinite God is the deepest possibility of finite being, as finite being, without canceling myself out, without, as Pope Benedict says, reneging on being human. I can still be human fully, body and soul, man or woman, not both. And I can still respond to God without abolishing myself through a yoga or Pilates exercise that empties my mind and diminishes my humanity. Now, there are wonderful Christian practices by which you can quiet your mind, and spiritual exercises, which are all well and good. And in many ways, they parallel Buddhist practices of meditation. Keep in mind the difference. In Buddhism and other pagan forms of meditation, the purpose of meditation is to extinguish the self from finitude, from its torments, from the baggage of living. The purpose of meditation in a Catholic context is union with God. Do you see the difference in our culture now? Trying to give as many examples as I can think of. There is a fundamental difference between pagan forms of worship and Christian forms of worship, which will make use of and repurpose and elevate some practices that resemble them. Let's take a look. Look at the Old Testament. Remember the story of Abraham and his son Isaac. These sacrifices all throughout the Old Testament prefigure the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So in no way am I saying the notion of sacrifice leaves Judaism or Christianity. It gets elevated to union with God, not extinguishing the self. So in the story, God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. And at the moment of sacrifice, he steadies his arm and says, "Don't hurt your son. Do not lay your hand on him." Abraham notices a ram caught in the thicket. And so the ram is used instead. And God, Yahweh, praises Abraham for his faith and trust that he would sacrifice his own son in obedience. Now there's a subtext to that. It's actually a critique of pagan human sacrifice. That's the headline. We miss that because we think, why would God ask Abraham to kill his only son? That sounds monstrous. We're not in on the joke because we didn't live 2,800 years ago. The point of that story is to say to the Babylonians and then all the other polytheistic faiths around them, no more human sacrifice. Right worship does not require human sacrifice. We see it in the Passover. A lamb, a male lamb without blemish, is sacrificed. The Passover is God will pass over the homes of the Israelites who mark their doorsteps with the blood of the lamb. So we do have this sense of a ransom being paid, a sacrifice being made, but it is for union with God. John the Baptist points out to Jesus as the Lamb of God. There he is. That would have immediate significance to the Jewish audience who heard that. I'll get to your question toward the end. So I'm not critiquing pagan uses of animals as proxies. I'm showing the contrast between how they are elevated in Judaism and Christianity. In our time, we sacrifice to pagan gods in different ways, which I have pointed out. So what distinguishes Israel's worship from the pagans? The sacrificial system of all the world's religion, including Israel's, rests on the idea of representation. But how can sacrificial animals or fruits of the harvest represent man, make expiation for him? This is not representation, but replacement. And worship with replacements turns out to be a replacement for worship. Somehow the real thing is missing. What then is special about the liturgy of Israel? First of all, without doubt, the one to whom it is directed. Otherwise, or other religions frequently direct their worship to subordinate powers, the different gods, powers, and spirits of the world. Precisely because they know that only true God cannot be served by the sacrifice of animals, they leave him without worship. Sacrifices are aimed at the principalities and powers with which man has to deal on a daily basis. These are what he has to fear, to propitiate, to placate. Israel did not merely deny the existence of these gods, but saw them more and more as demons, which increasingly alienate man from himself and from God. Adoration is due to God alone. And having walked through, in my travels in Asia, various pagan temples, I can tell you that the statuary inside many of them are ghastly. The expressions on the faces of the people or the animals look like hunted humanity and animals in extreme pain. And so that's not all of the temples that I've seen in Asia as an example. But we are far away from that experience of man in desperate flight from powers that he doesn't understand and is trying to barter with. Worship in Israel and in Christianity has nothing to do with that. It has everything to do with union, friendship with God. Let me continue with this theme. Peace in the universe through peace with God, the union of above and below, is how we can describe the essential intention of worship in all the world's religion. But this basic definition of the attributes of worship is marked concretely by an awareness of man's fall and estrangement. It's not just about crops and making sure floods don't occur. I also feel alienated from whatever is divine, or my neighbor, or myself. But this basic definition, as I just mentioned, is marked by this awareness of fallen estrangement. Of necessity, it takes place as a struggle for atonement, forgiveness, reconciliation. Worship is the attempt to be found at every stage of history to overcome guilt and bring back the world and one's own life into right order. And yet, an immense feeling of futility pervades everything. This is the tragic face of human history. How can man connect the world with God? How is he supposed to make valid atonement? The only real gift man should give to God is himself. Now we pivot. Now I've caught you up. We can finally start talking about Catholic liturgy. We needed this running start to know what's at stake. What are the stakes in a pagan culture that we live in? If we immediately started with the Mass when we started this evening, we would not know what are the stakes. What's at stake? What are we confronting? Your neighbor who doesn't go to Mass on Sundays. What's going on? So, recall Jesus at his trial. One of the key complaints against him, apart from him claiming to be the Son of God and God, which would get you in trouble, was his claim that if the temple was destroyed, the Jewish temple was destroyed, he could rebuild it in 3 days. And they said, what are you talking about? It took 46 years to build this temple. But he was referring, as John says, to the temple of his body. Jesus' scarred body is the new temple. New worship without proxies, without intermediaries, without extinguishing ourselves. Direct worship. And as we read in John early on, chapter 2, zeal for your house will consume me. Jesus' zeal for right worship, as the Pope says, took him to the cross. The throwing over of those tables was not forgotten in the temple, the money changers. And that grudge was held. So his zeal for right worship contributed to his trial and death. Now, let's look at the Mass in this context now of this back and forth dialogue we have between God and ourselves, which makes real in the Mass, in the liturgy, makes sacramental, which can only be glimpsed at in all other religions, in all of their pagan rites. They only get a flicker of this. We get the real thing. So recall Act 1. So I break the Mass into two pieces for the sake of simplicity. So introductory rites, we are welcomed, we sign ourselves with the Trinity. What starts right away? The penitential rite. What's going on there? We go up to God with words of forgiveness. I confess to Almighty God, and so forth. Or the Lord have mercy, Christ have mercy, Lord have mercy. We go up with our words of forgiveness. God comes down with the Word of God in the readings, the Old and New Testament. And hopefully a homily that makes sense. That's the back and forth in the penitential rite, Act 1 of the Mass, of the liturgy, which is a work. I'm not static observing. It is a work I participate in. Act 2, the offertory. Homily is over. The collection is taken, and we offer bread and wine to the priest, who's God's representative. We go up to God with bread and wine and resources. God comes down with himself in the Eucharist. And as I put here, it is in the Eucharist we make real contact with God without losing ourselves. Recall when Moses approached the burning bush, because no one can see God and live. But in the sacrament of the Eucharist, we can participate with God really, truly, without obliterating ourselves. Also, as I mention here, the Mass, classically speaking, and obviously true today, is the sacramental representation of Calvary, the death and resurrection of Jesus, the death on the cross, presented sacramentally. And so the ritualistic double consecration of the bread into the body of Christ and the blood, the wine into the blood of Christ, this ritual separation of the two sacramentally makes present the death of Jesus on the cross. We are witnessing the cross once again. We are at Golgotha sacramentally. We then receive the fruits of the resurrection when we receive the Eucharist worthily. Remember, Israel in the desert receiving the covenant, learning right worship in the desert as a symbol of purification. St. Paul referring in his letters to present yourself worthily at the Eucharistic banquet. These are not terms that are political in any way, shape, or form. They are the substance of our faith. So as I put here at the bottom, Jesus Christ alone bridges this ancient gap of exodus and return, of this separation we have left to ourselves between God and man, God and creation. Jesus alone has power over sin and death through his death and resurrection, because he's God. And thus he bridges this gap, this infinite gap. And as a man, he can carry us across it. He becomes like us to carry us over. As Paul said, whatever is not assumed cannot be redeemed. Jesus assumed a human nature in order to redeem all of us, to carry us across the broken arch without destroying us. He assumed a human nature. He didn't come as a spirit. He didn't come as some shadowy figure in the heavens. He entered human history. The invisible is now visible in Jesus. What was then is now on our altars. You see how these dilemmas of belief in class 1, how can we make something from the past valid for us today? How can the invisible be made manifest to me to help my unbelief? The liturgy, the Mass, heals this arch, heals this broken freedom, and unites them in Jesus Christ and his sacrifice at the Mass. One other note I'll make, not on the slides. How priests say the Eucharistic prayers reveals their Eucharistic piety. I am not making any statements about any priest. I'm talking as a general rule. When a priest is reciting the Eucharistic prayers, and you can remember what they are, but right after we kneel, so let's take one that we're most familiar with, Eucharistic prayer 2. You are indeed holy, O Lord, the fount of all holiness. Make holy, therefore, these gifts, we pray, by sending down your Spirit upon them like the dewfall, and so forth. Who's the priest addressing? You can now participate. Who is the priest addressing? God as Father, right? All throughout that. In many parishes you'll go to, the priest is addressing us. He's looking at us. Or when he's holding the Eucharist up, this is my body. And he's showing everyone, like a traffic cop directing traffic. Who's he praying to? Us. He's missing the point of the Mass. The community, the gathered community, is not what we're worshiping. The gathered community is not what was broken on the cross and rose. The church in some way anticipates that by having the means of grace through the sacraments, through the lives of holy men and women. But what are we worshiping? We're worshiping the Eucharist in that moment. And so when priests are looking you in the eye as they recite that prayer, they don't know what they're doing. Their piety is horizontal. And the most in tune priests, the spiritual priests we know that we respect, and love, their focus is on God, because that's who the prayers are designed for. That's who's affecting on our altars the conversion of bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. God as Father is doing that. So when priests are wandering, looking around, showing things, their focus is off. So just remember that, and Eucharistic piety requires the transcendent. It's also why Latin can be very useful. Now we know why Latin is important. Before, maybe we did not. It has a very transcendent, vertical aspect to it. Okay, so continuing. See, we are almost done. We got through it. I'm proud of you all. But I didn't take any questions yet. So let's summarize this. The distinctive and unique quality of Catholic worship is the real union of heaven and earth, of God and man, in the sacrament of the Eucharist. God acts sacramentally in the world. He uses physical reality to convey spiritual presence. Matter is not fallen. What is finite is not unusable. It is not garbage. A sacrament is the union of the physical and the spiritual. And we know this intuitively. A handshake is a kind of sacrament. You have the physical touching of hands, and you have the invisible spiritual communication of friendship. A word is a sacrament. You can hear my voice, the audible sound of my voice, the words I pronounce. There's the invisible spiritual communication of meaning. Christ is the supreme sacrament because divinity was communicated through a human nature in history. There he is. The church is a kind of sacrament, as Vatican II says, because you have an institution, an organization, people, hospitals, schools, and you have the presence of the Holy Spirit. And in special ways, in the seven sacraments, which Jesus commissioned through the apostles and their successors. So, sacramental X-ray eyes. The Eucharist is about promoting that in us as a spirituality. So just as what we have witnessed on the altar, so too may we be. And St. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was probably a great 20th century example of this. She spent an hour after Mass in prayer before the Eucharist every morning before she walked the streets of Calcutta, and she saw in the poorest of the poor Jesus. This fuels our actions in the world, this sacramentality which starts in the Eucharist, which is located in the Mass. Now we see the full significance. So to summarize, and you've all been very good, how confront today's culture? How renew today's culture? How understand it? And then confidently proclaim the good news of our faith. Pagan worship of today, of yesterday and today, that seeks to atone or to be made whole with the self and the cosmos, is a regression back to primitive times, by which man is dehumanized and the gods are placated anxiously. We reluctantly and with some concern think about how burning fossil fuels contributes to global warming. We are nervous about how using plastic bags at the grocery store might contribute to global warming. We nervously push out our green garbage can to the curb with, separating recyclables from not. These are the rituals of the modern world. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm all for clean water, I'm all for clean air, but it is knit into our pagan sensibility to find rituals by which we worship the planet, and there are plenty of them. I've mentioned many already. So we're anxious. We're not at peace from all these activities? Certainly not. Some of the most unhappy people on the planet are people who have these types of causes. They're never happy. What is only approximated or glimpsed at in all other religious worships of this exodus and return, in order to bridge this gap of our own estrangement from God and self and ourselves, is actually accomplished through the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, the God-man in history, sacramentally at every Mass. Every Mass, we achieve this union with God that all other religions cannot accomplish and leave you estranged and alienated. That arch that was broken by the fall, by sin, which made this back and forth impossible, is now restored in Jesus Christ through his death and resurrection. True worship, finally, true worship is available to us. The door is open. Let me finish with a quote from St. Benedict. Man cannot get out of the thicket and find his way back to God. That's actually a reference to the ram that was caught in the thicket. Can't get out. It took Abraham to take that ram out. So too, it takes Jesus Christ to unstick us from the thicket. Man cannot get out of the thicket and find his way back to God. The shepherd who rescues him and takes him home is the Logos, the Word himself, the eternal Word, the eternal meaning of the universe dwelling in the Son. He it is who makes his way to us and takes the sheep onto his shoulders. That is, he assumes human nature. And as the God-man, he carries man, the creature, home to God. And so the return becomes possible. Man is given a homecoming. But now the sacrifice takes the form of the cross of Christ, of the love that in dying makes a gift of itself. Such sacrifice has nothing to do with destruction. It is an act of new creation, the restoration of creation to its true identity. All worship is now a participation in this Pasch, this passing over of Christ, in his passing over from divine to human, from death to life, to the unity of God and man. And so we read with John when Jesus says, I, when I'm lifted up from the earth, will draw all to myself. True freedom, true liberation. The Mass accomplishes this, and the door is open to us. So with that, that's a lot of material. But it was so impressive to me to share the Pope's reflection on what is the essence of the liturgy and the Mass. What are we doing when we are attending Mass? And you can see how it moves us out of a frame of passivity, of I am observing what the priest does, to active participation. I am part of this work, and the work will continue when I leave the church. X-ray eyes to see in the circumstances and people of my life God's presence. Okay, so we have 5 minutes for questions. So the question is, clarify more what you meant by exodus and creation. And exodus is a Greek word from the Latin exitus. And I used it because it might have been more helpful, but it may not have been clear for you. So exodus, I'm not referring necessarily to the book of the Old Testament. I'm referring to the outpouring, the exitus, where we get our English word exit, of God toward creation. This outpouring, this exitus, this exit of God. Exodus is the Greek word for exit in English. So, thank you, the Big Bang. So this outpouring of God is the first move, and our return is the second move. Okay, other questions? So the Pope is German, and we tend to be ponderous and use philosophical jargon, but realize this work was written in 2001, I think it said. when he is taking on more pastoral duties, but he's a theologian at heart. He's an academic at heart, and some of the terms I know are, the $10 words. So,
Thank you.
So no class next Tuesday, but our topic when we return will be on the church. And the Pope wrote his dissertation on the church, and it was his favorite subject to teach, and he never wrote a book on it, though. And so this book, Called to Communion, is a collection of his writings over many years on the church, which we'll walk through. This is the key slide from a Catholic point of view.
Yeah, right.
This slide right here, of what is going on in the Mass.
Okay.
But keep in mind, the lectures also have a broader audience of people who might not even be Christian, might not even believe in God.
Exactly.
So I'm casting a wide net. You might say, Charles, you spend an hour on nothing to do with the Mass. And that's true. And a lot could be said more about the Mass. But we will dial back in class 4 and be more scriptural and spiritual in our reflection on the church. But this is the key slide. If you're thinking, what do you want me to take from this, Charles, in 3 minutes or less? It's this slide. Okay. Have a good week off, and we'll see you on the 10th of July. Thank you.